University of Jordan. Part of COP28 activities that will officially start by the end of this coming November. And also, I would like to thank APC's team and staff for preparing and working on this, and also all members of the International Advisory Board, distinguished members and colleagues who helped all of us of COP28 activities that will officially start provide by the end of this coming November needed insights. And also, I would like to thank challenging APC's team and staff for preparing and today's webinar, and also entitled "Critical Currents in the Climate Vortex" and Unearthing the Power Dynamics in the Climate Change Policymaking. It's a very long, interesting, complicating title. I loved it though. And I'm joined with their excellencies. I start with His Excellency Mr. Atul Kaushik from India, a very well-known expert and government person of India. She is the Global Development Center at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS, and is the Vice President of the Committee for Advanced Trade Research, CATR, of the Trade Promotion Council of India. He was India's negotiator for international trade and climate change, and India's lawyer to the World Trade Organization and the Permanent Mission of India in Geneva. In addition to that, of course, he worked in so many different areas and has edited books, including Reflections from the Frontline, Developing Country Negotiators in the WTO. My second guest speaker is His Excellency, again, Dr. Brian Mantlana, who has an outstanding record and academic qualifications from leading scientific institutions in Germany and the Netherlands, and who also joined in 2017 the CSIR to lead the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services competence area, and currently is responsible for leading holistic climate change impact area at the CSIR. Also joined by His Excellency Dr. Imad Adli, the General Coordinator of the Arab Network for Environment and Development. It's called RAED, R-A-E-D, Chairperson of the Egyptian Sustainable Development Forum, ESDF. Of course, His Excellency Dr. Imad, as a General Coordinator at the Arab Network for Environment and Development, is an environmental and sustainable development activist with over than 30 years of services and engagement with leading international, regional, and local organizations. And of course, the Arab Network for Environment and Development is recognized by the Arab League as a representative of the civil society in the Council of the Arab Ministers responsible for environment, and I'm very delighted to have all of you. Now, let's delve into the situations of the current political situations of the climate change. In other words, I would like to simplify it. So we're talking about politics of the climate change, politics within countries and between countries, and then the big divide, the global and the south, the north and the south, global south and global north. And, the politics of blames, who to be blamed and who blame whom, again, locally and internationally. So I would like to invite my distinguished speakers, starting with Mr. Atul, to give us his, first round of a statement of assessing this global, regional, local political climate of the climate change and the climate itself. So, Mr. Atul, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Namaste. It's an honor for me to join all of you for this first webinar of the T28. Let me also start with joining all of you in the condolences that we offered in the beginning to Madam Kutebebi for the loss that she suffered, and move on to the topic of the first session, which is power dynamics and mapping actors in climate politics. So let me spend some 3 or 4 minutes on the 4 points that I want to cover in this. The first being the role of developing nations in the global climate politics. From the days of the Earth Summit in 1972 until the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in 1992, and getting the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change going, the developed nations never shied away from owning up the responsibility of historical emissions starting from the pre-industrial levels, agreeing to the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities of nations to address emissions conundrum. They agreed to the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, which contained commitments by them on mitigation. However, since then, pressure from their domestic constituencies, particularly businesses who were used to extractive and exploitative means to benefit their shareholders, they began to renege on their Kyoto commitments, abjure their responsibilities to finance adaptation and mitigation measures, and find ways to transfer technology to developing countries on fair and reasonable terms. This pressure from their constituencies has deepened and the constituencies widened, resulting in developed nations trying to pass the responsibility on to the private sector and the emerging markets and nations, as well as asking developing nations to focus more on mitigation than on adaptation, clean production and consumption than on loss and damage. The global south, on the other hand, took time to realize that they are suffering more than the others on account of climate change. CBDRRC that I mentioned gave them escape routes to avoid policy action and focus more on economic development by whatever means, until, unfortunately, the suffering became too evident. The sea level rise, disasters, and heat-induced calamities started hurting their people as well as their growth. The solutions of the Montreal Protocol type for the ozone depletion were no longer on offer. So they focus on adaptation, marshalling resources from within and without, and still depending upon CBDRRC to address mitigation. Several of them have leveraged leapfrogging technologies and practices where available to move to clean and green growth pathways, but find that too little and often too late. With the Paris Agreement coming in 2015, however, a newfound energy to establish nationally determined climate-friendly policies is seen in them, together with a greater determination to negotiate climate justice in international policymaking. Now, within the global south, the emerging powers like India and China recognize that their growth trajectories have a significant effect on greenhouse gas emissions and, um, as a consequence, on the rise in temperature, sea levels, etc. To contribute to the collective effort to address this crisis, their nationally determined contributions are becoming more ambitious, and increasing proportions of their national budgets are going towards green growth and technology leapfrogging, often through their homemade frugal innovations. Unlike the developed world, they are making commitments to keep India, for example, is on its way to meet most of its INDCs in time. At the same time, they recognize the need to take leadership position within the developing country brotherhood and often take strong positions in negotiations. This is also necessary to assuage their own domestic constituencies, most of them still struggling to get a decent living standard. The fourth stakeholder set here, the civil society, whether from the north or from the south, is largely empathetic to the effect of this crisis and vocal within their national as well as international advocacy efforts. If their voices are heard, nation states need to do much more on finance, technology transfer, and on loss and damage. Let me stop here for a moment. Thank you.
So very much, Atul. This is a comprehensive opening and thorough too. Allow me, before inviting Dr. Imad, to welcome our fourth guest speaker today, Mr. Rajani Ranjan Rashmi, who is a distinguished fellow and program director of Earth Science and Climate Change at the Energy and Resources Institute at TERI. He works on issues relating to climate policy, strategy, carbon, markets, and environmental sustainability. He's a retired officer, of course, of the Indian Administrative Service, and experts on administrations and policy planning and implementations, and won the Prime Minister's Award for Excellence in Public Administration back in 2008. Mr. Rashmi, welcome to the panel, and looking forward to your contribution. Now, meanwhile, I would like to invite Dr. Imad Adli for his opening statement, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zaid, and very delighted to be among this distinguished panel. I again also send my condolences to Dr. Abtisam for her loss, and wish all the best for her and her family. Let me start. I think Dr. Atul, he put a very good introduction about the situation from the global point of view, the dilemma between the North and South, the dilemma between the local challenges at regional level, at local level or national level, and also the dilemma between who is taking the first step to make the change, because until now, after attending more than 15, or I think I already had like 18 COP I attended in the last 30 years, we're still, even when we feel like we are having a kind of progress, when we go back and then we try to evaluate what we have done, we find that we are still very far from what we need to do. As you, Dr. Zaid, made in your introduction to me, I come from the civil society, and what we have been trying to do since, and by the way, RAED, the Arab Network for Environment and Development, organized the first climate change dialogue in May 1992. This was more than 30 years ago. And we realized at that time that the region where Dr. Zayed and myself, we come from, is facing the challenge, and we don't really feel how difficult it is. And we passed through even from before 92, but from 92 when the convention was started and till now, we have passed through different COPs, but also through different global progress. And one of the things, and I want to put here the emphasis on the SDGs. The SDGs that was already announced by the UN in 2015, and we already passed more than half of the period. The evaluation and the assessment of the situation right now, that by 2030, we are not going to meet more than maybe 15% of what we wanted to achieve from the SDGs, and more than 80%, at least half of it, will not be achieved, and some are going to be even being worse in the area of, especially when it comes to poverty, especially in Africa and in the very poor countries. This means that if we are linking between the situation when it comes to the climate policies and the climate actions, and we link this with the livelihoods of the communities that are affected by the sea level rise, affected by the extreme events from heat waves or cold waves, and is affecting the food security and water security in many of the countries, especially in the south, that this situation is not getting to be better, and the opposite, it is going to be worse. And we are still talking about and thinking about how the loss and damage fund is going to be addressed or going to be discussed further in Dubai. So this means that at the community level, people are not really seeing any progress that happened. Maybe we have progress on paper in the sense that we have in Denmark, we agreed on the $100 billion, but until now it was not, it is not a reality. And the $100 billion itself, it is peanuts compared with if you are talking about $100 billion a year, this is peanuts compared with the needs. If you look at the NDCs coming from different countries, you will find the total that we need is much more than what we are having of challenges at the national, at the local level. I'm going to focus in my point.
Maybe
here. Yes.
Maybe later I stop you here if you don't mind, Mr. Ahmad. This is the 5 minutes that I asked you for, and I appreciate all what you've mentioned, and then I'll come to wrap it up and make sense. I mean, linking them all together, so make it also easier for our followers and audiences to interact with what we do. Dr. Brian, it's your turn to tell us what you think of the situation as it is today.
Yes, good afternoon, colleagues, and good afternoon, Dr. Zayed, and thank you for the invitation. And I've listened to Mr. Kaushik and Dr. Ahmad for their insightful opening remarks. I want to make 5 brief inputs. Maybe 4. I see you are strict on your time management, Dr. Zayed.
I'm very tough.
I want to start by saying the topic that we're talking about here is very important. The issue of global governance of climate change is very important. Whilst ultimately the nation states are the ones that will implement climate responses, the role of global governance of climate change is crucial. So that's my first point. Right. And there's a question of, has the global governance of climate change delivered? Has it delivered on what it was set up to do? And here we can differ, but my view is that despite all the challenges, despite all the issues that they had to deal with, without the UNFCCC process, we would not be where we are on climate change, on global climate change response. So that is my sense, is that despite the inadequacy of the response, the global response, I think the global governance framework has contributed to the prominence, even that of climate change, even at nation-state level. And this is important, Dr. Zaid, this conversation, because in the last 10 years or so, we've seen another development paradigm coming through in the climate change landscape, which is that of clubs, whether it's G20, whether it's G7, there's been several clubs that have been coming up. And that's good as it serves some part of the process that emanate from the global governance of climate change. However, it's important to specify the significance of the role of UNFCCC because of its inclusion, being able to listen to all voices and to accommodate differences and not clubbing up common views. So I want to highlight the significance of the global governance process as a central pillar of even that of nation-state climate response. Secondly, the other aspect in terms of looking at what is the state of climate change politics, I think one of the other aspects we've seen in the last 10 years is the prominence of non-state actors. Dr. Ahmad talked about the evolution in part of the UNFCCC process. But in the last 10 years, we've noticed the prominence of non-state actors. And it's very important to acknowledge the role of non-state actors, whether they're from the South or from the global North, but they have been effective in influencing the outputs, the outcomes from the global governance process of climate change. And I want just to leave it there for the time being, that it's another component that we should keep in mind as we talk about the politics of climate change, is the role of non-state actors.
And this is your point. Thirdly, you're running short. Okay.
And thirdly, one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is how has climate change risen up the global political profile? And for me, is recognition by many role players that climate change is not an environmental issue. I can build on this later on, but to me, that is one of the aspects that have helped the climate change discourse to gain currency in global politics. The recognition that it is not an environmental issue, it is beyond that. I'm going to leave it there, Dr. Zaid, for now, and I can elaborate on these issues. I talked about the prominence of global governance as the UNFCCC process, the prominence of non-state actors, and that climate change is not an environmental issue. Thank you.
Thanks to you, and I certainly will take you up on the third point you made. And, you know, to decode this statement of that climate change is not an environmental issue, which of course I just happen to agree with that. Now, Mr. Rashmi, it's your turn, please, to share with us your, opening remarks and the opening statements. 4 to 5 minutes, short to the point, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Yadat. Thank you for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to talk about it. I'll make short points, and I'll try to be within my limits. The first thing which I wanted to say, and I think I agree fully with Dr. Mantlana, is that the existing governance structure of the climate change based on UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement has delivered to a large extent, not fully. So it's not a question of replacing this governance system, but improving upon it. In fact, the Paris Agreement is certainly an improvement in a very large sense. After almost 25 years of the existence of the UNFCCC, we were able to, the world was able to remove the annexes and bring up a universal commitment of everyone. So this is a very major step which the world community has taken. But the question now is, this universal commitment which we now have under the existing governance structure, has it been able to deliver? And I think there the problem lies. We still see a position where the global emissions are still rising. And why are they rising? They are not rising only because of the developing economies, which are in any case in the growing phase. They're rising also because the developed countries, which were supposed to peak in 1990, they are still increasing their emissions. A large number of them still do. Very few developed countries are there which have stabilized, which have peaked, and which have made a transfer away from the fossil fuels to renewable energy. I mean, countries like Sweden and maybe UK and a few others are exception there. But the large number of developed countries have still not fulfilled their commitments, and the global emissions continue to rise, aggravating the climate change problem. So the problem is that despite a good governance structure, we have not been able to deliver on the results. And the reason is because the people who are responsible for this have not fixed ambitious targets. In fact, the responsibility of taking an ambitious target doesn't lie on the countries which are in the growing phase. It lies on those countries which have already stabilized their economies, which have already achieved a high standard of living. They should fix higher targets. So the second point is we should improve upon the existing governance structure, but the second point is that we should improve upon the targets. The targets which have now been undertaken by most countries are in the long term. I mean, people have talked about 2050 net zero economy, 2060 net zero economy. But what we want in view of the aggravating climate crisis, short-term immediate targets which should help us bring down the emissions. 2030, what is going to happen in 2030? Nobody is clear about that. In fact, the assessments made by most of the organizations is that amongst the G20 countries, a country like India, for example, is the best performing country as far as its NDC is concerned. So, so there should be a responsibility of other major economies which are part of the G20, which constitute almost 80% of the global emissions. They should fix their targets in an ambitious manner and implement it. And they should work upon the short-term targets rather than the just state long-term targets and be satisfied with that. The second point is about finance. The finance is really critical to any ambitious action. But we basically see that the current finance is, number one, the scale is very low. We have not been able to achieve even the $100 billion target. We are now looking at the new quantified goal of climate finance, which will be discussed in Dubai and which will be fixed from 25 onwards. But the question is, whatever it is, we need to mobilize and involve all sectors. Obviously, public budgets will not be enough to provide the kind of finance which we require. It will require in trillions of dollars. That is the scale. And that can come only if we are able to mobilize the private sector, the multilateral development banks, the financial institutions. We should be able to de-risk the investments. And we should have a global system of de-risking this investment so that the investments start flowing into the greener sectors, which is what the developing economies, the growing economies, where the emissions are growing, to help their energy transition. So that is the second point, that we need the kind of finance which is which allows the countries to take steps to make energy transition in a faster and ambitious manner. And we need an environment of investment where the risks are lower. We need a global system. The developed countries or the countries which have responsibility should be able to create a global pool of resources where we should be able to reduce this risk. Fourth point is about technology. We should also build up technology alliances. Unless we do that in the newer sectors like the development of alternative fuels and green hydrogen, and we will not be able to decarbonize the industrial sector beyond a point. So we need a great amount of international cooperation there. It's not enough to talk only about carbon capture and storage at this stage. We need technologies which can help us develop alternative fuels, and we should pool in resources and technology and all possible resources to help countries do that. And last point about adaptation. In all this talk about mitigation, we normally forget about the needs of adaptation and building climate resilient infrastructure. It should receive equal attention, and I think that is the challenge which Dubai is going to face. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Rashmi. This is absolutely brilliant, like all the other statements. And I think, this is shaped the debate of this conversation, of today's webinar, by actually raising so many important issues, whether the fourth point you mentioned or the fourth point by Atul, or what Imad says and Brian's as well. You know what? Still, Keynes said, who cares about long-term policies? We all will be dead, right? So politicians, act out of a very narrow, short considerations, kind of political calculations. And this takes me immediately to the current political debate about the climate change and the actions needed. See, it is easy to say we have a governance, that we need to improve the governance, that although there's a good governance, bad governance, but they're not delivering to what they're supposed to be delivering. The players, non-state actors, civil society and others are important, are vocal and vital into shaping the debate over the climate policies. Yet, they don't see eye to eye, nor they're in the same page when it comes what are the problems and what are the solutions. If you're talking about all other things, then we're really having an atmosphere and a big, huge, heavy influence of political divide about the issue of the climate change, which makes it absolutely non-environmental issue. So I would like for you, by trying to map it to me, who are the major players, the power dynamics, mapping power and dynamics, who's deciding on climate and for what reasons? So people will understand when talking about, why we know the problem years ago, and yet we're getting worse, and we arrived late to the party. The damage already happened. So why did that happen? And then what's next? So I'll go one more time to Mr. Atul in order just to reflect, to react, and to engage us in his intellectual browse to the questions and issues that I've raised. Mr. Atul, please.
Thank you, Dr. Yadav. I'll just make a short point about the political divide, and that is that these are compulsions from domestic constituencies, and you very well phrased it, that politicians look at their next elections, but when they were the 1992 agreements, they talked about intergenerational responsibilities, and intergenerational responsibilities cannot be met by 5-year program cycles. It is no single nation, no single organization, no single sector that can take responsibility to bridge this political divide. It is a multiple, multifaceted, and multidimensional, cohesive, domestically as well as internationally, policy coherent action that is required. Difficult, not impossible. It has happened earlier. In my initial remarks, I mentioned about the Montreal Protocol. It was a success, and we can devise ingenious solutions of that kind going forward also. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, this is fantastic, and just in a very concise way, speak to the issue. And I'll take it directly to Dr. Imad Adli. Say, you've mentioned, you start working on these things as a first civil society, maybe in 1992, about these issues. And I don't know how long did it take the Arab League to see that as, hello, this is an important thing, let's talk to them. As always, as usual, Dr. Imad. So, building on what Mr. Atul has just, beautifully characterizes the situation, and how he's concerned about the deep divide, political deep divide. So, what do you think the non-state actors, including civil society that you're representing, can really, what role they can play, if at all?
Let me start by saying that the political divide, unfortunately, is not only between the North and South, but actually between the South and South. And this is why the position of the South is not strong as it should be, because we at some point, and it's very clear, we found that there are different opinions and different positions between Africa and Middle East and Latin America and so on. And then the political divide is also at the national level. When you are fighting for so many years to establish a mechanism that will be not only for the climate, but as you said, it's not an environment issue. You are talking about the economic situation and the economic prosperity for the people. And to do this, you have to take the climate into your plans, and short-term and long-term as well. What the civil society is doing is we are trying always to play, and also it's very difficult in the Arab region, as you know, because let's be frank, in the Arab region, we have also the divide between the oil countries and the countries that are, developing in the normal sense. But there is also a divide in this case, because the position of the Arab countries is also affected by this divide geographically in the region. So what the civil society is doing is two things, actually. We are very much engaged, and RAID and many other civil society, we are very much focusing on the capacity development of the different stakeholders at the local and the national level. Because at the end of the day, the disaster is not going to wait until the political divide is resolved or the global governance is achieved. The problem is happening every day. The farmer who's losing his land is affected right now. And this is why the capacity development and the dialogue, the local dialogue that we are building on at the local level to understand the challenges that they are facing, this is very important. But let me tell you also, there is the role that has to be played by the international civil society organization, because we have to support our education, our research systems in our countries. Without doing this, our countries will stay far from what's happening at the global level. And this link between universities at the international level, and also with the South in our countries, and building the capacities of the research centers and pushing on the governments to put more financial supports for education and research. This, I think, will be also a solution, because even if we get the support that we need from the North, it will not be enough to solve our local and national problem. We have to initiate at the local, at the national level, the mechanism that will help us to face the challenge. And this, I think, education, research, capacity development of the people, and the local dialogue is very important at this level to make things moving and to see the implementation, even if it is very small in size and impact, but still it is important to achieve at the local, at the national level.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And, tell me about it, the need to support universities and research, and how research is so much detached in most of the Arab countries from, not only what people really need, but also from contributing to policy making and making kind of design for climate actions or climate policies. So you're right in that sense. There are so many things to be done, but the truth is, and let's face it, the divide is not only within the South. Of course, there it is a divide, global, North and South, within the South, but also within the North, and within certain, the same country in the North. And when these political and ideological viewpoints are shaping our understanding of the issue, we can see how, that is reflected on no actions, no plans, no policies, which, again, we're arriving too late to the party, it seems to me. And with that note, I'll take it to Dr. Brian to give us insight of, again, this, these political currents and the political debate about it within and between. So between global North-South and within, but also speaking to the statement of climate is not an environmental issue. I think, you owe the people an explanation to that. So to you, Brian.
Thanks, Dr. Zaid. I want to build on the Mr. Atul and Dr. Ahmad's points. The political divide is likely not to go away, certainly not soon. I think we need to embrace it. I want to use a different word to what the previous speakers used, which to me is the focus, should be the focus of this decade. And we know we are not delivering on it. And that word is implementation. Irrespective, despite and because of the political divide, implementation is not an option. It has to happen. However, Mr. Rashmi talked about means of implementation. And this is a key issue. It's not only the flows, but it's the adequacy of means of implementation, specifically finance and technology and capacity building. And these are the issues that Dr. Imad talked about, specifically referring to education. I want to use another word here, Dr. Zaid, which is co-creation. To me, it's another phrase that I would like to see it gaining currency in national, sub-national, regional, global climate response. It's co-creation of solutions. This notion that we're going to educate others is perhaps outdated. And the reason is because all of us have some level of knowledge, and we should maximize that knowledge. The question is how. And that takes investment, which Dr. Ahmad was talking about institutional support to communities. So to me, two words: implementation, emphasis on implementation. And that will address the issue that was mentioned by one of the speakers earlier of where are we in delivering on SDGs? And that has got to do with implementation. Secondly, is co-creation. And for me, as soon as we talk implementation, we run to technological solutions that I have nothing against, by the way. I've spent my youth participating in some of them. But I'm realizing that communities, local spheres, I'm based in South Africa, and our work reaches out to the broader African continent. And the level of awareness, yes, can be improved, but if we can listen more, we can also learn a lot from these communities and build on that platform. One more minute just on this issue of climate change is not an environmental issue. As soon as we moved climate change discussion to finance, and we took it away from the environmental sector to treasuries of nation states, that's when it became, in my view, began to get prominence. And the fact that it's not only the environment, as we know it's the environment that suffers because of impacts of climate change, but its livelihoods and lives demonstrates clearly to us that climate change is beyond an environmental issue. Thanks, Dr. Zaid.
Very convincing, Dr. Brian. I loved the co-creation and I hated the co-creation. And you can tell why. I love it. I mean, is absolutely that we have actually to come together, thinking together, and bringing like-minded and unlike-minded, focusing on policy and implementation. But we still need people to need education, so you don't put us out of job, because otherwise I can't find anything to do. I mean, except for co-creation with you, some of these policies. But no, I thank you for coming up with this term. I think it is it speaks for itself, and we agree all that moving the climate debate from it is environmental habitat, natural habitat, to it is human, political and finance, and the whole debate changes, and also the way policies are made changes. So, Dr. Rashmi, you've listened to your colleagues and their ideas on this, and also you've talked about maybe climate governance is not as bad, but still we can't deliver to what we have, and we're still focusing on delaying actually our deliverables to 50 and 60 while we're facing maybe more immediate challenge in shorter time. Now, in your opinion, reflecting on what you've heard, how would you do to improve this global governance, to speak to the more immediate challenges, climate-related challenges, but also how you provide a solution to the finance of the entire policy implementation? Dr. Rashmi.
Yeah, Dr. Yadav, thank you very much. I agree that this political divide is not going to go away in the near future. After all, the Paris Agreement also talks about this basic responsibility in terms of distinction of responsibility for developed and developing economies. So this is going to be the baseline, but we can certainly build on this. And there are successful examples of international cooperation in other environmental fields. Atul talked about Montreal Protocol, but the reason why such a under Montreal Protocol, the international community was able to deal effectively with the problem of ozone depletion was because they were able to provide extensive finance and they were able to develop technologies. And there was absolute cooperation on that. They were all focused on this issue. All the major economies which were using ozone depleting substances, they phased it out over a period of time with the technologies which were available, and they were all paid for it. The industry was paid for this transition. We need a similar exercise in terms of fossil fuels. We have to make transition away from fossil fuels in a foreseeable period of time to renewable energy and to clean energy. Now, how do we involve the industry in this? That is the key question. And you talked about non-state actors. It's true that the target fixing or the responsibility of implementing the targets has to remain with the governments, which are the member states of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. But certainly the other stakeholders need to be involved and incentivized to make this transition. And that is where the role of finance comes in. We have to evolve a financial system and a system of technological cooperation which feeds the requirement of the industry and other stakeholders. So clearly, the corporates, the industries need some kind of an environment in which they are able to meet their financial needs at a low cost capital. So that is the real problem. No investor will invest in a renewable energy project or a cleaner energy project if the cost is higher than the cost of the fossil fuel based energy system. So we have to create an economic and financial environment in which the industry is incentivized to use alternative technologies, and naturally the costs of the capital, the financing have to be brought down. Who does that? Should it be left entirely to the domestic financial system? I mean, in that case, then where is the need of international cooperation? So if we need international governance of the capital climate change, we need this international system to be able to meet the costs to a certain extent and bring down the cost of capital. There are ways of doing it. I mean, there are a number of experts who are putting their heads together to do that. I mean, one simple solution, which at least one example which I can give is that investors in India, for example, if they have to borrow from the international capital market to finance a renewable energy project or a green or a steel producing unit based on green hydrogen, they have to borrow capital from the international capital market, and there is a currency risk here. So the cost becomes 4% higher than the normal capital which is available in the domestic financial system. So this additional risk, the burden of risk, has to be borne by the international players, and we need to create a global fund for that. So this is one example which I'm giving as to how we need to bring down the cost of capital for investment in greener projects to be able to support the industry to make this transition, just as we did under the Montreal Protocol. The point about the non-state actors, I still feel I'm of the view that while we may need to incentivize them, involve them in these extra efforts, the responsibility of implementing the policies and creating the right kind of environment lies with the governments, and that's where we need to cooperate. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Rashmi, what I say, this is music to my ear. It's all very high-level, technical, and rational talk. Reasonable, actually, talk. However, I have a problem looking at what you're saying and how reasonable and how that's appealing to the situation and providing solutions. But, allocations of resources, private and public, is subject again to political calculations, personal, individual, and organizational. Of course, when you look at the South, and I'll give you the Arab countries as example, and when you see that, the issues of poverty and unemployment are the most, low-hanging fruits challenges for the government that they have to deal with immediately. And also, if they fail, then they're going to be their end. So you can imagine where their thinking and their resources and their energy is going. So instead of actually providing a much more balanced, environmental and climate-friendly kind of thinking, I'm talking domestically, and especially within the South, but also that is true, that's applicable to the North, despite all of the regulation. So I'm saying this is perfect. My problem is how we're going to make it work in countries that they're seeing their most immediate challenges are issues has to do with humans, with poverty and unemployment. I'll come back to to comment on that if you don't mind. Now, I also would go back again. Just forgive me for keeping this order, but I think it's good because it's naturally complementing each other. So, Mr. Atul, I'm going to raise two issues for all of us, the four speakers, to reflect on, in addition to this poverty and employment, and the most or the more immediate political challenges for political systems and countries and states, especially in the South. But I'm going to raise two things to keep in mind, and then ask questions. Am I complicating it? Oh, well, I'm trying, by the way. Okay, all right. So I want to keep the issue of the question of how bad the situation is when it comes to climate and security issue. We in political science and I are talking about, a new, I don't know how new now it is, maybe it's old, new emerging security threat. And the climate is at the top of these security threats. And I'm talking about state security, not human security only. So how bad a situation and how that is a serious security threat. This is a question, two questions, 2 points for each of you to reflect on. My immediate direct questions to you, Dr. Atul, Mr. Atul, is China, and then India, and then their very bad / very good influence, impact on the whole climate politics and debate. Can you educate us on this, please? You're muted, Mr. Atul, like most of us.
Yeah, thank you. Let me try and address the two questions. But before that, let me say in the beginning, I'm give you a very interesting anecdote in the beginning to just say that it's not China and India alone who are either responsible or worrying about what is happening, but every country in the world is. Yesterday evening, I was coming into Abu Dhabi for a meeting today morning. And I found something very interesting in the flight. It was an Etihad. I heard a podcast. This podcast was about the effort of the UAE to understand and address climate crisis, not as a crisis happening elsewhere, but on its own land. Now, UAE ratified the Kyoto Protocol back in 2005, irrespective of which annex it belonged to. It built the Baraka power plant through use of sustainability-inducing technology, brought down its per person emission over the years, working on clean fossil fuels, carbon capture and storage. The list goes on. And why not? 90% of its people and infrastructure are in coastal areas. It has resolved to use solar energy, stop use of internal combustion engine by 2034, and so on. So it is eminently placed to debunk the polarization or the political divide that we have been talking about, and to bring the ministers back onto the table on first principles when they come here for COP28. Now, coming to this responsibility sharing, look at, I can talk more about India than about China, but look at India. Mr. Rashmi already mentioned, and I have been working in wearing another hat about the G20 presidency of India, in which we have studied the level of sustainable development goals that we are going to meet. We're doing quite well, as Mr. Rashmi pointed out. Similarly, on climate, in Paris, we took very different position from our historical positions in order to bring together the Committee of Nations in a situation which was otherwise a conflict between the North and the South, whereby we introduced, and the Paris Agreement introduced, the intended national contributions, nationally determined contributions. The INDCs that India has filed are largely on track. So that is the kind of responsibility that each of our countries has to take. Similar stories are coming out of China. The amount of transition that they're doing in the transport sector to renewables, the amount of mitigation efforts that they're taking. So the emerging countries, or the so-called emerging powers, are taking steps on their own. But they still have the poverty issue. They still have the growth issue to tackle. And that is something that cannot be denied to them at the cost of, as others have mentioned, those who had commitments not implementing them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and keep the two questions in mind. And coming back to that, I'm going to harass you. Dr. Imad, so you've heard some of the main comments related to what you've said, especially from Dr. Brian, especially the issues of education and the role of civil society. Now, given the discussion we just had with Rashmi and Atul about growth and poverty and unemployment, and how we prioritize, and then where the civil society, the non-state actors, where they can fit, what they can do in order to fill in these gaps. So if the government is busy doing some more important thing to what political systems think, which we cannot deny their significance, especially from political point of view, regime survivals, as we call it. So I think this is a huge responsibility and burden on the honors of the civil society. So what do you speak to that, including the co-creation and the education? Dr. Ahmed?
Yes, I think there is no, from my point of view, there is no problem between having the priorities of the governments to survive and the priorities of the people working for development to continue. Because the whole idea is how to make your decisions are smart decisions, and the way that you can turn the challenges into solutions. When it comes to climate, or to most of the issues that we are dealing with and related to climate, there are many ways, and then I don't want to repeat again the role of education and universities and so on, but there are solutions that could provide the solutions for unemployment, and at the same time you are dealing with climate issues, and you are also dealing with the poverty, because they are very much linked. And getting back to your two questions, the situation is bad as climate. It's going to be worse. From the records that you can see on how the number of people who are displaced because of the climate impact is very much terrifying, because we were talking about a few millions 20, 30 years ago. Now we are crossing the 100 million and more of people who are displaced because of the climate risk. So the poverty is getting to be worse, and the unemployment is going to be more, and the conflicts are going to be more, even in our region. Look at what happened in Sudan in the very beginning. It was a climate issue. For example, in Darfur, even there are some studies saying that in Syria, the conflict in Syria also was very much exaggerated by, or nourished more with the climate impacts and the drought in some areas. So I think what we need is smart regimes, smart thinking, in bringing all this together and putting solutions. And this is what I think is going to make the difference. Whatever we are getting from the global support and from the north to south will not help, as I said before. But let me add one thing about China and India, because this is something that I want also to raise here, and I would like to hear from your point of view. When we look at the emission, for example, I think that, when people talk about, when I hear people from the north coming and say, the south is not really serious about the 1.5 degrees, I always say, but who is in charge of the emissions? You can stop, you can switch make the switch like this, and we don't have emissions. But when it comes to China and India, I cannot, this is my personal opinion, I cannot blame China and India for what they are producing for two reasons. Number one, the emission per capita is very low if we compare how much they have. Plus, what they are producing is already used, globally. So the response, and it's not only per capita, per the China, how many people in China and how many people in India, it is globally. So it is unfair to put China and India on the same level like the North and Europe and the United States and Japan. It's very unfair. So at the end of the day, the emission is going to be reduced not by the South. The emission is going to be reduced by the North. And if they want to blame anyone for that we are not reaching the 1.5 degrees, they have to blame themselves because they are in charge of the technology, they are in charge of the funding, they are in charge of the historical emission happening and also the emission happening now. What we need in the South, we need to be more organized and we need to build our capacities to be able to face the challenges that are facing our livelihoods and to decrease as much as we can the negative impacts of the climate, but it is going to be worse, unfortunately. If we are talking about the short term, it's going to be worse in the coming 5 to 10 years with all the global governance dilemma that we have seen in the last 20 years. Back to you, Dr.
Dr. Ahmed, thank you very much. Well, this is amazing. And, beyond the politics of blame to be blamed, I'm not sure how many people will agree to your statement about China and India not to be blamed. Now, I understand, again, their national, rational choices and priorities, goals, and as we all do. But at the very end, this is what we're talking about, rational and reasonable. What's good for me, but what is good for me and the others. Yes, the North had its share, its big, huge shares of the entire dilemma. Yet their contributions in solving it, I think, is unmatchable in terms of technology and investment in technologies. That most of the speakers were saying, this is the way to go in order to deal with these things. So let's also bring this kind of the two sides of the coin to see how countries can, at the very end, dialogue, and moving away from the political blames to the responsibility to act and do. And I'll come back to you in order to comment on that. But Dr. Brian, I have let me just turn off my video. I have a question coming from our audience, and this is Kuram Khan saying, this is for everyone, but now for Brian in particular, because you were talking about co-creation and other things, how a societal change can be brought to shift from use of fossil fuels to renewable energy in third world countries like India, where around 2 million people die annually and after subtracting minorities. I think I'll take the same question to Mr. Rashmi and Atuls. And also, he's saying, what is this? After subscribing minorities around 20%, mortal remains of over 8 million that have funeral pyres. The farmers burn leftover of harvested crop that is a serious problem for clean air in India and its neighbors. So that's something. My point is about this societal change. So how the co-creation can really be linked to create societal changes and cultural changes and value changes that appreciate, environment and the climate. So Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Ahmad. I can't help but make a passing comment on where you started. the emerging threat of climate change as a state security. This is a personal view, as Dr. Emma would
It's
say.
not imagined. It's not imagined. It is these new emerging security threats, my friend.
No. I'm not saying it's imagined. I'm not saying it's imagined. All I'm saying is that I want to make a brief comment on that. For me, I firstly agree that climate change does pose a state security threat. That's point number one. I agree with that statement. The concern that I have is, where do we locate in the UN process, where do we locate the center, the seat of that conversation? I have genuine concerns of locating the seat of that concern in the UN Security Council, precisely because of representation. Who is sitting there? Less because I do not trust the people sitting there, nor the nations sitting there, but more because of inclusivity in addressing state security issues. So for me, I think it's important, again, that the multilateral process owns this place, this space of security and climate change, so that it's addressed in an inclusive manner, in a way that promotes justice. Then I'm not an expert on China-India issues, but I want to say again another point here. For me, what's important in those two countries, what we from the Global South look forward to, is active cooperation between these two countries on key strategic issues. And I'm not sure those are happening. But to me, that is what is going to move the needle in global polarized world, is when India and China find avenues where they can coordinate amongst themselves and start working together. To me, that is that would signal, when we start seeing the return on investments in that collaboration, that would signal a momentous shift in global politics. Lastly, on the question by Khurram Khan, in Africa, one of the terms that are gaining currency, and it's very ambitious of me to say that and talk on behalf of Africa, but is the notion of just transition. And one of the aspects we are learning about the just transition is we are learning that we are actually, our starting points are different. So this whole notion of transition is less of not only understanding transition to what, this societal transition, but from where. So within our countries and across our countries in the region, we are learning that it's important to locate from where do we want to proceed, the point of departure in this transition. And lastly, and that's linked directly with the notion of adaptive capacity. One of the speakers earlier on, and I noticed in the agenda, I couldn't find the word mitigation quite easily, but I couldn't find the word mitigation quite easily in the agenda, but I saw adaptation quite clearly, and to me that was attractive. This notion of adaptive capacity is very important for most of our countries in the Global South. And addressing that, asking ourselves difficult questions around the notion of adaptive capacity. How do we deal with the various facets of adaptive capacity? This is pivotal in societal behavior, in societal change, in societal transitions. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I mean, this is the whole thing of transitioning from where to where, or this bringing about social change, changing from what to what, how and for whom. these are all, not only value associated, related questions, but they're political by nature. And we've been suffering in certain places and areas in the globe. This kind of a globalized, unilateral, liberal kind of living, according to certain views, is what should be adopted. And so any societal change is to there. Now, from where, I think it's irrelevant in the debate, but it has to be at the center of the debate. I have definitely no differences, and I agree fully with what you said. Now, allow me to take this, what you've said, and actually I have, as I said, how bad the situation is, coming back to it, security-related issue, and adaptation mitigation. These are my remaining points that we need to focus on till the end of the seminar. Mr. Rashmi. So you've heard the question on the societal change, especially in India. And my question on India and China role in doing good, bad to the climate. And then I will push you a little on technology. So see who's doing what, where, and who is financing that as well. Dr. Rashmi.
Thank you. Yeah, let me take this this question about India and China. I find it rather amusing when people talk about India and China rather than the people on the transatlantic countries or the countries in Europe. Because the problem of climate change, we are talking about solutions. India and China, I don't think they are part of the problem. In fact, they are part of the solution now. And that is the reason why we had the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was, if you remember the history, in Copenhagen in 2009, it was the basic countries comprising of India, China, Brazil, South Africa, and the US, Barack Obama, which led to the Copenhagen Agreement, which is now the template of the Paris Agreement. So the entire movement in terms of political action on at the global level has taken place because of these four countries and the US together. So I don't think one can say that India and China are lacking in ambition. And if you look at the statistics, some of which I think was quoted by Atul and maybe some others, you can quote any number of third-party assessments. I mean, I have the reports made by German Watch and the Climate Action Tracker in the US, and all of them have certified that India and China are the best performing countries as far as their NDCs are concerned. In fact, I remember in 2010 or 11 itself, the then vice chairman of the NRDC of China, Mr. Zenhua, who was their lead negotiator on the climate change, and we were all together. And he made this point, almost 12 years ago, that the efforts made by developing countries like China and India and others, Brazil, South Africa, put together are far more than the developed countries. So if you just compile the statistics, and these statistics are available even now, the German Watch has certified this, that amongst the G20 countries, it is the countries in the developing part of the world which have done much more than those in the developed side. So it's both on the statistics side and on the qualitative action side, I think the developing countries as a whole are doing much better. Question is, how do we make the transition at the ground level? That is the real question. How do we enable the industry to make the transition towards greener technologies? And how do we build the capacity of the countries to withstand the adverse impacts of climate change? There we have to find solutions rather than point fingers. And here I will come to the question of technology, to which you refer. The technology is really the key. Technology and finance. Technology and the finance linked to specific technologies. The most important question in the energy transition is before the developing countries like India, China, South Africa, Africa as a whole, even the Middle East. The question is when you make a transition away from the fossil fuels, you have to look at the expanding energy requirements. Number one, the energy affordability, energy access, and the impacts on the people who are dependent on this energy system, impact on their livelihoods and their social issues. So we have to take a comprehensive picture in this transition, and you have to make it just. How do you do that? You will be surprised to know that despite the fact that it is tough to make this transition in countries like India, despite that, the investment in renewable energy in the last 10 years has outpaced the investment in the coal-fired sector. In fact, the cost of solar power today is cheaper than in India than coal. So there is no investor who is investing anymore in coal now. In fact, that has come to a stop. People are investing more in renewable energy like solar, wind, and others. But it is not enough simply to invest in the solar energy. It is also important to meet the growing energy demand. And where to do that? The existing capacity is not enough to generate the level at which you consume the energy. And that is where you need backup supplies, either from nuclear energy, hydro, or coal. So we have to create a technological solution to store the energy.
Mr. Rashmi, you're muted. You muted yourself.
I'm
Unless
sorry.
you want to say it secretly, you can
No,
write
no.
it.
My apologies there.
That's
I was saying that we need global alliances in technologies to create technological solutions in terms of energy storage based on renewable energy, and also the green hydrogen and other alternative fuels. These these technological innovations will not come overnight. They will take time. They will take 10 years, 15 years for them to become commercially available and scalable at a cost which industry can absorb. So this is the kind of investment and cooperation which people need. Thank you very much.
No, thanks to you, and rest assured, we'll let no one mute you. This is beautiful statements and minds, so thank you very much. Again, now I have more questions coming from the audience. I'll review them after I take it back to Mr. Atul to hear your reflections on the two issues or the three issues: adaptation, security, and how bad it is. And I'm going to add a fourth one for all of us, that is the climate diplomacy. I hope we'll have enough time to cover all the four. So I'll start you, Mr. Atul.
Thank you, Dr. Yadat. This is quite a bouquet of issues, but let me take them one by one. On the security issue, I'm largely in agreement with what Dr. Bayan said, that location of the discussion is an important issue. And climate is a calamity. Calamities cause concerns, including security concerns. Let us not look at them like Hollywood looks at these horror films. Let us look at where each issue belongs. And we find the location for security issues in the Committee of Nations where they have decided to locate that issue. As regards the point made by Mr. Khan on societal changes required in India and on the emissions. On emissions, I must simply agree with what Mr. Rashmi said and add that even if you don't want to look at German Watch or any other studies, look at the IPCC, which is what the UNFCCC and what the negotiators in climate change look at. And you will not find the two issues mentioned by Mr. Khan as the primary contributors to emissions of the IPCC. And you, Dr. Yadat, have already mentioned it. Adley added that per capita emissions, the responsibility certainly does not lie in countries like China and India. On the question of what is happening in terms of climate diplomacy, Again, it's a question of where would the issue be located. Let me take trade as an example, which is another area that I cover. During the Uruguay round, trade and environment was a committee constituted by a compromise solution to discuss the relationship between the two. And it was decided through a negotiated report, which was submitted to the ministers in Singapore, the first ministerial conference, that trade and environment are and should be and should remain mutually supportive. So that is the way that international policy coherence is being forged between organs of the multilateral environmental agreements on the one hand, and other related organs, international intergovernmental organs like the World Trade Organization. And it may be quite ironical to see that even though we were in 1996 at that time, which is post UNFCCC, climate as a terminology did not figure in the report that the negotiators sent to the ministers to Singapore. However, today, in the various committees of trade, of the WTO, climate is not only discussed, but it is a part of the agenda of discussion, a formally agreed agenda for discussion. And there are countries who are representing the WTO bodies in those discussions on climate change, which are reporting on what is happening. For example, what happened in the high-level stock-taking event on those members who launched the discussions under Trade, Environment, and Sustainability Work Plan. There are discussions on agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability at the ministerial level, which are being then reported there. And the discussion is creating that international policy coherence. A similar policy coherence is required at the domestic level also. And that is an area where more work is required, and domestic constituencies are a challenge for our politicians who need to take a coherent view, both inside and outside their discussions in the country and outside. And in that regard, I can talk about the lifestyle changes that are required, the societal changes that again Mr. Khan was referring to. Something very interesting has been propagated by India, by our Prime Minister in the last few months, particularly during the G20 presidency in India, called Lifestyle for Environment. SDG 12 on sustainable the societal changes that again Mr. Khan is an SDG that the Committee of Nations has to meet. And an offer has come to look at the components of lifestyle for environment, which talk about sustainable production, talk about sustainable consumption. And it's not a very technology intensive effort that is required, unlike some of the issues that we are tackling, that we are addressing in the case of climate change. So these are the kind of lifestyle changes, the societal changes that we have to innovatively think of, introduce them in our daily lives as policy actions, which will incrementally contribute to addressing climate change calamities so that they do not become security issues. Thank you.
Well, this is profound. I appreciate it. And I can't but agree. And if we can debacle the issue of climate change of being associated with state security and security threat, and to be used as such or to be thought as such through the innovative way he was proposing, I think this, we do the planet ourselves a great favor. Let's hope that is happening. Now, I'll take it to Dr. Imad, and while posing the same questions to you, how bad security issues, adaptation, but I need to read this to you, particular Dr. Imad, because I have Dr. Muhammad al-Sanusi, who's a lecturer of political economy, Faculty of Economics and Political Science, who is also sending his sincere condolences to Dr. Sam, and share with Dr. Ahmed Al-Adli what he raised regarding the historical controversy based on the difference in climate policy between developed and developing countries, South and North. And with regard to climate policies, he says is it time to change the tone in which all the climate conferences operate? Developing countries and countries of the South always complain they are the least contributing to environmental pollution. Why don't the pressure of these countries be diverted from mere pressure exerted within the United Nations climate conferences? So, Dr. Iman.
Thank you very much. Let me first start with the question coming from Dr. Mohammed Sunusi. I think the language and the way that the UN conferences is always organized is always putting the tone and setting the tone for the results that we are seeing, and I would say the failures more than the successes. And I think this brings us back to the first point of the global governance, and of course the role of the UN agencies and the UN system itself, including the Peace Council, and the role that is played at the global level on this, because it is definitely does not put all the countries on equal footing. It's always putting the developing countries in the weak point. But I agree that we don't need to be only in the UN conferences complaining about the role of the North and the responsibilities and the historical responsibility and all this. I think we need to do more at the national again, and to see how we can improve our national strategies and national plans to be able to face the situation. And this is going to be linked to the security issue, because it's very clear that it is the link between climate and security is very obvious, and it's also a signal of emergency that everyone has to look at very carefully. We are talking about communities that are very much affected by the climate, and the number of IDPs, the internal displaced people, is increasing, as I said before, and this will put more emphasis on the role of the local governments and how they are going to deal with the situation. And honestly, what we are talking about here and what we see in the UN conferences, look at what we hear from the government officials. Go to any local government in any country of what you have heard and ask them about what is going on. They know nothing. They don't have the capacity, they don't have the tools, they don't have the resources, they know nothing. You tell them about the climate adaptation, and they know nothing about adaptation. I meet governors. I'm not shy of saying this. I meet governors who are in the same level of the presidents, and they tell me, and they whisper and they say, we know nothing, and we don't know how to deal with the situation. So this means that the problem is not that the link between the climate and the security issue. The problem that we don't know at the local level how the link is strong between the two things, which might make the situation at some point, really disastrous in some areas. And look at the situation, for example, what happened in Bangladesh or what happened in Pakistan. And due to the climate disasters, we did not even learn from the lessons. We see the news, and we have 2-3 days we get influenced by the news, and then 5, 6 days, 1 week after that, we back to normal and back to the same situation. So the link between the security and the climate is very high. But let's also and be honest that the issue of climate until now is still in the hands of most of the time in the hands of the ministers of environment in the different countries. And the ministries of environment is not that strong, especially in the south. And this is why at some point I was saying, I was making like a fun. I said it would be better if we give the issue of climate to the ministries of defense, because in this case, these are the people who have this, they have the power and they have the tools and they have the abilities to do what we, but really linking climate to environment and to, the SDGs and so on, this is not going to make a big achievement. We have to reshape how we look at climate at the national level and put it at the right level of it, because it is very much linked to climate, to security and peace in our South. Thank you very much, Dr. Zaid.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmad. Dr. Brian, I'm coming back to you with a question too. And the question is coming from Rania Al-Zarbi, one of our audiences, attendees in this webinar. And she's, of course, thanking you for insightful webinar. Coming back to trust issues raised by Dr. Brian, would the technology supply integration be a new narrative proposed by strong, powerful political actors that will end up with natural resources exploitation and maybe a reason for worsening the climate change crisis? So, Dr. Brian, I would like to borrow your brain to answer this question and also to reflect on security, how bad, and climate diplomacy. Back to you, Dr. Brian.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Zaid. Again, I spent a bit of my research time on this work of climate change and security.
Welcome aboard.
I must say upfront that within the African region, that conversation is dominant in the central and western part of Africa. However, we are seeing trends that are breeding ground of climate security linkages, even in the eastern and southern part of Africa. So to say the obvious, there's a link between those two phenomena, security, state security and climate change. Again, I want to go back to where is the seat of the conversation? Where should that seat be? And as a personal view, I do not think that seat is Security Council for the issue of inclusivity and role players. It would entrench the lack of justice aspects, excluding the affected people from the conversation, even further by locating it in the table of the few that are found in the UN Security Council. On the issue of trust, that Rania has asked, technology supply integration, will it be a new narrative proposed by strong, powerful political actors that will end up with natural resources exploitation and maybe a reason for worsening the climate crisis? Again, I've worked on UNFCCC issues for more than 10 years, and the blaming game has not taken us anywhere. If there's any lesson that personally I've learned, is that it does not help to point blame and say who should act and why that person should act. The issue of responsibility. Allow me, Rania, to build on what Ahmad said earlier, which is at local level, local being at domestic national level. My sense is that at national level, we can do more in terms of ensuring that the exploitation of natural resources is done for the benefit of those countries that have the natural resources. We can blame the West, we can blame the global North, but I believe that we in the global South, within our countries, have the means to minimize that exploitation of our natural resources to the point that it begins to benefit the local communities. When I say local, I mean the national domestic constituencies. We have the means to do that. We are not using those. If I can be explicit, Dr. Zaid, my sense is that in the global South, we can improve in exercising the authority that we have in ensuring that the exploitation of our natural resources is for our benefit. And we are not doing that. So blaming the North is not going to take us, has not taken us anywhere since the political independence of our countries. So I personally, I do not buy that approach. I put the responsibility squarely on our leadership internally within our countries to position our people first and the needs, the known needs of our communities first. Thank you.
Dr. Brian, thank you. Thank you. Look, I can't agree more. Politics of blames is not helping, is not taking us anywhere. Now, understanding what happened, reflecting on it is important and is something. But keeping, in that cycle, a vicious cycle of blaming, it's not us, it's them, is not going to do anything. And it is for our own interest now, actually, the South, to really, multiply our efforts and mobilize our resources to do what we have to do, to speak to our threats, challenges, needs, and opportunities without stuck in the past, as we always like to do. So I salute you for saying these things, absolutely. And now I'll take it to Dr. Rashmi, and by reflecting on what's been said, security related to climate adaptation, but more so is the issue of the climate diplomacy, and you've been yourself part of this. So, would love to hear your thoughts on that. And just housekeeping note before you start, Mr. Rashmi, I'm sorry about that. After you finish, I'll also will ask you, if you don't mind, to give me your final thinking, because I'll go the other way around now, instead of giving you waiting. And I would like to ask all the esteemed guests to prepare their final statement, reflections, takeaway from this webinar. So, Dr. Rashmi, please.
Thank you, Dr. Yadav. Thank you very much. I'll be brief in view of the time that is available to us. On this issue of climate security, or the climate change being an issue of international security, others before me have spoken very eloquently and very comprehensively about this. My submission is that the climate change is a global environmental problem. It has other economic, social, and financial implications. It has certain typical consequences for a few stakeholders. But if you look at the entire length and breadth of the impacts of climate change, it remains an environmental problem. So, certainly, the appropriate forum where this problem has to be discussed and solutions have to be found is the Paris Agreement, or its mother convention, the UNFCCC. The other institutions which have been talked about, like Security Council and others, would not be the appropriate institution where this kind of problem can be discussed. because we can't find solutions there. And there are three reasons for this. Number one, climate change is a threat not to the international security, but to the ecological balance of the countries. And this has both global as well as local implications. So it is a threat to the ecologies and the environments. And we have to, and this problem has been recognized already in the UNFCCC in form of the problem of adaptation, adverse impacts of climate change, and resilience issue. So we have to find solutions there rather than trying to talk about it in terms of global security issue and force decisions in an institution which is not appropriate. The second is that, after all, we have to find solutions through international cooperation and not by finger pointing, as somebody was saying. It has to be a collaborative and cooperative solution, and it has to be an as inclusive institution as possible. And therefore, a forum where we can discuss these issues comprehensively, without bitterness, without mutual recrimination, without pointing blame at somebody, based on consensus, that is the right forum. And thirdly, lastly, after all, the solutions are in terms of mobilization of resources and technologies, not just military strategies. So we will have to think of institutions and appropriate solutions in terms of resources and technologies which you can bring on the table here. That was as far as the climate change as security issue is concerned. The future, how do we see the future evolving in terms of increase in the ambition and increase in the intensity of action, so that we can arrest the rising trend of global emissions and mitigate the adverse impacts? I think there are two key challenges here. We have to ensure that we are able to agree on a long-term goal for mobilizing climate finance in Dubai, if not in Dubai, as early as possible, because the life of the existing climate finance commitments in terms of $100 billion is going to end in 2025. So the immediate challenge is to agree on a climate finance goal beyond 2025, which should become, and secondly, this goal should not remain anchored only in the public budgets. It should become a comprehensive financial mobilization involving all stakeholders, including multilateral development banks, financial institutions, and the private sector. And therefore, we will have to think of correct and most effective solutions in the global financial system, which can help us raise the trillions of dollars which we require. Essentially, we have to ensure that the transitions which are taking place in the domestic economies, beginning with the energy sector and moving on to other sectors of economy like transport, agriculture, industry, in due course, those transitions are financed by this global financial system through the domestic institutions. That is the key challenge here. So first is to agree on a climate finance goal, and then agree on the instruments of using those that finance and those resources for the transition. The emerging challenges here are that we are getting caught in a situation where some countries are confusing between trade and environment. I think we are going to see some examples of where some countries believe that by forcing trade actions in the name of climate, they will be able to increase the ambitious actions of a few other countries and their trading partners. I think this may not be the right way of going about it. This will create more conflicts, because we have had examples in the past, like international civil aviation, where a similar tax or trade-based instrument was tried upon. Finally, the matter had to be taken to ICAO. I think we need to build a collaborative solution here and avoid such instruments which confuse the linkage between trade and environment. It should be supportive and not conflicting. The last point which you talked about, what is the how do I look at the future? I have already talked about the finance goal. I will suggest that there are two other things which we need to look at in the future. One is the global adaptation goal, which clearly should be agreed either in Dubai again or as early as possible, so that we have a framework in place for financing and for and identifying the critical actions in the domestic system of countries. And secondly, the global stock take. After all, it's a business of fixing responsibilities, fixing targets. And in the global stock take process, we should look at who has done what. We should look at review the performance of countries, and not just in terms at the global level, but we should also see that those who have a greater responsibility should take greater amount of the targets, so that we achieve fast track the responsibility of bringing down the emissions across the board. Thank you.
Dr. Raj, we thank you very much. I'm sorry to cutting you off, but you deliver to the points precisely and magnificently. So thank you very much. Now I have less than 6 minutes left, so we need to divide in between the three speakers and me, which I'll consume 5. I'll give you 1, so you divide the one between yourselves. 1 minute. I'm joking, if you get it. Now I'll get back to Brian and then Ahmad and then Atuz, with all my respect. I have comments and kind of questions coming from the audience that I would like to share with you. So in your final statement, closing statements, remarks, please try to address these comments, questions, and I'll give each one 2.5 minutes to answer. So from one international advisory board member saying the climate crisis is also an opportunity for nations in the global south to lead in the search for social and technological pathways for development that reject the energy-intensive, mass consumption, and environmentally destructive pathways for global north. I'm curious to hear your opinion about that, they say. And another member saying, thanks for the great session. You've covered a lot of ground, but to ask a particular questions to all the guests, there doesn't seem to be a lot of optimism. And as such, do any of the speakers see a positive way out of the climate crisis that can be practically implemented given the current structures and institutions we have to deal with? And this is a very practical question as well. And then I have Ahmed Shikara, I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, saying, appreciate your excellent session. Pollution has not been mentioned at the age of boiling climate, not just climate change. So I'll take it to you, Dr. Brian, make sense of what you've heard and give us your final remarks.
Thanks, Dr. Zaid. Again, thanks for the invitation. I'll take a minute. Optimism. Personally, I'm cautiously optimistic. Why? Lessons from how the global community responded to the COVID-19 are what gives me cautious optimism. It is possible to respond proactively and actively to climate change. The question is, and I leave this with you, Dr. Zaid, and your audience, despite what we know about climate change, why do countries treat climate change as an insidious, slow-moving issue? Thank you.
Well, I'll take it. This is a burden, but thank you very much. This is powerful. Dr. Ahmad.
I'll try to be very brief and respond to
yes.
I think what we need is, we already learned from that the governments are not going to do much in the short period of time. We have tested them several times. When I heard the leaders of the world in Glasgow in the first 2 days talking and making this, I said Glasgow will be a turning point. At the end of the day, the same challenges and negotiations. This means that, blah, blah, blah is still there. The only thing from my point, and to be optimism, I think, optimistic. I think we need to have an alternative way of thinking, alternative way of dealing with that. But this has to be linked with the global finance mechanism. And you have to use the non-state actors, get out of the governments, because at the end of the day, when you are dealing with climate adaptation, you are actually dealing with the people at the community level where they are facing the problems. Find alternative ways of dealing and reaching the communities and getting to the points and to the problems and solve them. This is, I think, the only way that we have to do and to find an alternative way of dealing with the climate. This is my optimistic way. At the same time, I think we need to use the United Arab Emirates as a place where we can build more linkages and partnerships. And maybe through the T28, we think about how we can build this kind of partnerships. And this could be a result of the debates that we are having here, that we have a new alternative for cooperation and partnership. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmad. Mr. Atul.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zaid Adat, and thank you very much all the co-panelists who have actually summed up very well what I needed to say. I'll just add 2 points to complement what they have said. One is that the domestic and international policy coherence that I talked about in my earlier remarks needs to seep into our policy governance initiatives, both at the national and international levels. And as Mr. Rashmi said, Dr. Ahmad Adli also said, there are ways in which that can be done by involving both governments who have limitations on what they can do in the immediate future and the other stakeholders like the multilateral development banks and financial institutions who can build upon the growing need to develop a concrete finance goal so that we are not left with nothing in 2025, which is just 2 years away. The second point to talk about is on international policy coherence. United Arab Emirates is in a very important position today to have both COP this year and the ministerial conference of the WTO next February. And I would suggest that issues which are not germane to the discussions in the United Nations Conference on Climate Change need to be shifted to the locations where they belong. For example, the CBAM and other issues. The UAE government can itself push for that to happen in the trade discussions that they're going to have next year, so that we focus in the upcoming COP on the 3 issues that Mr. Rashmi pointed out. At the national level, adaptation is a very serious issue for all the developing countries. Now, with what's happened in Hawaii, even developing countries cannot remain unscathed of it. And they must realize that they need to create structures, governance structures. In India, we took 10 years to create the National Disaster Management Act that combined both the sub-federal level and the federal level institutions to come together to result in a situation where in 20 years, we've gone down from 10,000 deaths through a cyclone to almost none in the most recent ones. And that is a collective effort that has to be contributed both at the national level and at the international level. Thank you for the invitation for this session. It was excellent. Bye-bye.
Well, I can't find a better way of ending this very, very good discussions and webinar. So allow me. Well, it's been actually, to me, it's such a pleasure to moderate such a session with a very distinguished and esteemed colleague. I really thank you so very much for the insights that you shared with us. I could not have actually hoped for a better start off of the entire program of T28. And I'll take this opportunity to thank you, every one of you, and to thank all over the attendees. who actually reached out up to 40, I guess, those who raised the questions and those who just been there listening to us. I would like also to re-thank again the team of APC for excellent preparation and management, and of course for Dr. Kissam for creating the entire new idea of T28. Never existed before. We have a lot of COBs, well, 27 before. This is the first time we have the T28, which represents think tanks and thinkers like yourself contributing to the global good and to better future. Thank you, and hope to see you in person soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.